Hello and welcome back to the second video in this series on how to make an RPG in MakeCode Arcade. Last time we looked at starting with creating a player, getting that player to move, creating a tile map to act as the background or the level or the world, following that player around with the camera, setting the background color, and also creating an enemy. Or at least in our case 4 enemies using the repeat block. I've updated a couple of things just to make things neater and tidier. I've replaced the sprite of the player from a picture of a duck to a little man or player character. I've also updated the enemy to, instead of be an old computer for some reason, I've decided to use a design of my own. Anyway, we're going to jump on immediately from this, moving on to the next little section, which is going to be all about combat. So, at the moment, our enemies just kind of do nothing. Playing the game, we can see whilst walking around that we've got 4 of these lion enemies, and they do absolutely nothing. We're going to update that to make them a little bit more interesting. We're going to have them so that they follow the player automatically. Now there's a lovely block to do that. It's available in the sprites panel, so go ahead and clicking on that, and in the sprites panel we can find, scrolling down in the physics section, this option down here called Set My Enemy Follow My Sprite. I'm going to choose that block, I'm going to pick it up, and I'm going to put it in the bottom of the repeat 4 times. So everything inside the repeat 4 times at the moment is our enemy creation code. I'm adding a little bit extra to the enemy creation code to set each enemy to follow the player once they have been created. Now, first thing we can see is we've got 2 errors right here, and if I click on these warning symbols it'll tell me what the error is. In this case the error is the variable my enemy is never assigned. The cause of this error, well, basically what this is saying is that we have never called anything my enemy. In the previous video I called my enemy sprite something along the lines of enemy sprite. This time I renamed it to enemy moss lion. That's just the name of my enemy. So what I need to do is I need to click this drop down arrow here and change it to what it should be. So enemy moss lion. And give it a second, and fingers crossed, yep, that error goes away. We need to do the same thing for my sprite. My sprite should actually be player sprite, so I need to use the drop down arrow to change that over to player sprite. Okay, wait for the error to go away, and now we can go over and look at the simulator on the left and see what change has been made. So I'm going to click play, and as I walk around I can see that I am being tailed by a load of lions. If I reset the game, you can see they come flying in off screen and just start annoying me. Now there's a small problem with this. If your enemies can move that fast, then it might not be very fun for the player. Whoever's playing the game might find it a bit unfair that the enemies can move with what seems to be infinite speed. So let's change that. Let's make those enemies slower. Now one thing we can do to do that is going ahead and clicking on our Set Enemy Follow Sprite block. The block that we just placed down, you'll notice that has a little plus symbol on the end. If I click the plus, it unlocks more options for us. So I've clicked the plus and it's giving me now set enemy moss lion follow player sprite, but this time with speed. And at the moment speed is set to 100. So let's change that. Let's turn that down to something more sensible, like 20. By turning it down to a slower speed, it should make the game easier to play, because you're not being swarmed by enemies instantly. And there we are. They're moving at an alright pace. I can still outrun them, but they are still a threat. Okay. Now that the enemy is following us, we'll probably need some way of defending ourselves, some way of attacking the enemy. And this is where we get to use a new event. At the moment, in our code, we have only one event. This is the onStart event. An event is one of these blocks which has a flat top and forms a C shape. And this block gets triggered every time a certain event happens. In this case, onStart gets triggered when the game starts. We're going to add a new trigger. This needs to be outside of onStart, and the trigger we're going to add, the event we're going to add, is found in the controller panel. And in the controller panel, the second block down is a on A button pressed event. This event gets triggered when you press the A button. So I'm going to pick this up and I'm going to drop it down, and I'm going to drop it down outside of onStart because this is its own event. And here we're going to put in the code to show that we are attacking. Now, to attack the enemy, we need to do a couple of things. First thing we need to do is we need to somehow inform the enemy that we're actually doing some form of attack, so that the enemy knows how to react properly. We also need to update the player's image to show that they're actually doing an action. So this is a sort of a very basic version of animation. And if you wanted to, you could improve on that by adding more intricate animations. But for now, what we are going to do is we're going to start with the first part, which is getting some way of telling the enemy that we are doing an attack. And we're going to use a variable for this. A variable stores a value, and then we can read that value to work out what that is. And we're going to create a variable called sword swung. And what we're going to do with this is we're going to say, whenever the player is attacking, we're going to set the variable sword swung to be true, because we're telling the game we're swinging the sword. When the player stops attacking, we're going to reset that back to false. So to do that, we need to go to the variables panel. And in the variables panel, we can see that we've got some down here already. We've got enemy moss lion, which is the name of whatever the enemy variable sprite, enemy sprite variable was called. And we got player sprite, and we also got my enemy and my sprite, the two garbage ones that we wanted to get rid of. But what we're going to do here is go ahead and click make a variable. We're going to make a new one. And I'm going to call it something like sword swung. Or if you wanted to make it a little bit more generic, it could be player attack or something like that. But just for demonstration purposes, I'm calling it sword swung. Notice that I don't have any spaces. That's a good habit to get into with computer science. Naming variables with a space in them can sometimes confuse certain systems and is sometimes not allowed in certain programming languages. But I've got a new variable called sword swung, I'm going to go ahead and click OK. Now, if we carry on looking in the variables panel, we can see that it's added sword swung to the list of variables. And it's now given us two blocks down here, like set sword swung to 0 and change sword swung by 1. We're going to use set sword swung to 0. This block changes the value of sword swung to whatever we specify, and at the moment it's been set to the number 0. I'm going to pick that up and I'm going to put it in my on A button pressed. On A button pressed, we're setting sword swung to 0. Now the trouble with that is, if we are setting it to a number, it can be easy to confuse what number represents what. So we don't really want to set it to a number. We want to set it to, well, true or false. We want it to true when we are swinging the sword, and we want it false when we are not. So to do that, I need to find the value true. We can find this value in the logic panel. If I go over to logic and scroll down, at the bottom I can find these diamond shaped blocks, true and false. We want to set sword swung to true, so I'm going to pick up true here. And I'm going to put it straight in the slot where 0 was. I'm replacing 0 with true. So now what happens is when we press the A button on the game, we set the variable sword swung to true, and if we go ahead and play this, I'm going to go ahead and press A. Well, nothing really happens. And that is because we haven't taught the game how to deal with the sword being swung. So before we can go ahead and do that, I want to add a little bit of visual representation that we are swinging the sword. This is very important because the player needs to know what's going on. They need to see that they are swinging a sword. So for this, we're going to have to somehow show the character swinging a sword. And we can do this in a couple of ways. We can add an effect, we can do all sorts. One thing we can do is go over to the Assets tab. So let's click Assets. The Assets tab lists all the assets you have created in the course of the game. We can add a new asset here to represent the player swinging a sword. So to do that, I'm going to add a sword into the image of our player. But I don't want to overwrite the original, I want to make a new one. So for ease, and so I don't have to do a load of new drawings, I'm going to click on the one we already had. I called this one Player Idol. And I'm going to click Duplicate. By clicking Duplicate, it gives me a fresh copy that I can now draw a new sword onto. So looking around the Assets menu again, I've got the original called Player Idol, and I've got the duplicate called Player Idol 0. MakeCode has added a 0 onto the end to show that this is the one that's the copy. So looking at the one that's a copy, I can click Edit, and here I can do a little bit of editing to add a sword in. So what I might do, I might use the Select and Move tool from the panel in the left to select what I've got so far and maybe move them over a couple of squares. I might add a little bit of extra detailing, so I might have them stretching out a hand like that. You can spend quite a long time working on art and sprites. I won't go into too much detail because I don't want to take up too much time, but add a little bit of brown for the hilt, a little bit of this greyish silver for the actual sword itself, and maybe a little bit of highlight at the top just to show it's shining with, you know, the sun is shining on it. It'll add a little bit of reflection to it. So we have a sword for our character. Down here we've got the name of the asset. I might rename this to be player attack. Sensible names really help the development process. It really helps to remember what asset is what and so on. So we now have a small sort of representation of our player using their sword. I'm going to click done, and we can see that is now updated. Our next task is to change our player sprite's image to the one where the player is using their sword. So to go ahead and do that, we need to go back to the blocks and back to our on A button pressed event. And in here, I need to add a special line of code, a special block even, that will change my player sprite's image to the new one with the sword. So to do that, I need to go to the sprites panel. Let me zoom out a bit on that so it's easier to see. In the sprites panel, we can scroll down all the way to the bottom, and down here the very bottom line is set my sprite image to blank grey blob. This one will make your sprite wear a new set of clothes almost, and it's a good way of changing the look of your sprite without changing any of their interactions, any of their code. So I'm going to set my sprite image to grey block. I'm going to pick this one up and I'm going to put it at the bottom of on A button pressed. So the way that this works and the order that it goes in is the player presses the A button, we set sword swung to true, then we update the image of the player. Couple of things to fix. First thing is we've got another one of these variable is never assigned errors. This is again because we never use my sprite. So I'm going to use the drop down arrow and change that to player sprite. So we're now setting the player sprite image. At the moment we're setting it to blank. I need to change that. So I'm going to click in this grey blob, and if I go to the My Assets tab, I can find the newly drawn one that I just made, the player attack image. And there it is, the player attack. Let's go ahead and click done. So when A button's pressed, I swing the sword and I update my image to show that I've actually done that. Okay, let's have a little look at where we are with the simulator. Let's restart the game. So I'm still running around. I'm still being harassed by these mossy lions. Let's see what happens when I press A. Okay, when I press A, we can see that I now have my sword. And now, technically, I am attacking. Well, nothing's actually happening to the lions. They don't know how to deal with that yet. But also, I never stop attacking. As soon as I press A, I press it one time and it looks like I'm constantly attacking after that. That's not going to be a very fun game to play. If you are playing a game and you press a button to attack and your player never stops attacking, that's not so great. So what we need to do is we need to somehow turn off the attack after a certain amount of time. And we're going to do that by adding a couple more blocks to on A button pressed. To turn off the attack, we'll have to do everything that we've done so far in reverse after a little pause. So we need to set the sword swung to true, we need to update with the attack image, then we need to wait a moment, then we need to reset to our original image, and we need to set sword swung to false. Luckily, there's a lovely little pause block available in the loops panel. In the loops panel, we can find this pause 100 milliseconds block. It's the second one down. I'm going to pick that up and pop it underneath where we set the player sprite image. And we can put an amount of time in here. Like 100 milliseconds, 200 milliseconds, 500 milliseconds, and so on. 500 milliseconds is half a second. I think that might be a good time to swing a sword in, so I'm going to put half a second. If you wanted to change your game up, you could put in any amount of time you like. If you had, for example, a really heavy weapon like an axe or a hammer, you could put in a longer amount of time. So that if you had a smaller weapon like a dagger, that could have a shorter amount of time, and it adds a little bit of flavour and variety to the game. But I'm going to pause for half a second, and then I need to undo everything I've done in this event. So I set the sword swung to true, I set the player sprite image to attacking. Now I need to do that in reverse. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set the player sprite image back to normal. So again, back to the sprites panel, scrolling down to the very bottom where we get the set my sprite image. So I'm setting my sprite image. The error's popped up, so I know I must change my sprite to be player sprite instead. And now I need to choose the image that was the player before they started attacking. So I'm going to go into the grey blob, and in the grey blob, rather than drawing something again, I'm going to go back to my assets, and in my assets I can find the original image, this one here, and click done. So I've now reset the image of the player to back how they looked before they attacked. There's one last thing we need to do. We need to update sword swung back to false. So to go ahead and do that, I'm going to go to the variables panel. And at the bottom of the variables panel, we can find set sword swung to 0. I'm going to pick that one up and put it again at the bottom of on A button pressed. And this time we're getting a different error. If I click on the exclamation mark, it tells me that type 0 is not assignable to type Boolean. And this is a little cryptic, but basically what it means is we can't set something to 0 if it's previously been set to true. So 0 is a number and it's in an oval block. True is what we call a Boolean, as in true or false. And that's in a diamond block. So I need to find diamond block false to go in here to turn sword swung into false, and also to get rid of this error. So I'm going to go and click in logic, and at the bottom of the logic panel I can find false. So I'm going to pick false up, and I'm going to put it in sword swung to replace 0. And with all going to plan, boom, there goes the error. We have no need to worry about that error anymore. Okay. So far we have got it so that we can swing a sword. Let's actually test that before we move on. I'm going back into the simulator and clicking play. I can move around, and as soon as I press A, the sword comes out and then it goes away again. Sword comes out, goes away. Sword comes out, goes away. Sword comes out, goes away. Now we are no longer attacking constantly, we're only attacking when we want to. Still doesn't do anything about the lions. The lions don't hurt us, and the lions aren't hurt by the sword. So let's do that part next. To do this part, we're going to make a new event. And in this event, what we're going to say is when you are touching a lion, if you are attacking, that's great, you can hurt the lion. If you are not attacking the lion, then you get hurt yourself. So let's go ahead and do that. We need a new event. We need an event that's going to detect when we are touching an enemy. So to find that, I can go to the sprites panel, and looking through the sprites panel, around about 3/4 of the way down, we've got this big event here called on sprite of kind player overlaps other sprite of kind player. This event gets triggered whenever 2 sprites touch each other. So I'm going to bring this and I'm going to drag it out, and because it's a new event, it doesn't go in on start and it doesn't go in on a button pressed. Instead, it goes in an empty space on its own. On sprite of kind player overlaps other sprite of kind player. Well, that would be alright if it's 2 players overlapping, but we only have 1 player, so I need to change one of these to be enemy. And I'm going to choose this one on the right. I'm going to use the drop down arrow to change the kind from player to enemy. So on sprite of kind player overlaps other sprite of kind enemy. Now what will happen is every time the player hits one of the lions, this event will trigger. And it's in this event we need to handle what happens if the player is swinging their sword or if the lion is going to attack. So for that, we're going to set something up using an if statement. An if statement compares a variable and works out how to deal with that depending on what the result is. So in logic, we can find that there is, in the conditional section, 2 if statements. This is what we call them. We've got if, which just deals with one eventuality. So if age equals 15, then do something. If name equals Simon, and so on. However, the if else deals with what happens if the otherwise happens. So for example, if age is greater than 50, say you're more than 50 years old. Else, say you're younger than 50 years old. So to make more sense of that, we're just going to go ahead and pick it up and put it in our overlap event. if else. And what we're going to do here is if the sword is being swung, then damage the enemy, else damage the player. So to do that, we need to compare the variable sword swung to whether it is true or false. And what we're going to do first is we're going to compare it with true to see whether it is true. So what I'm actually asking is sword swung true? Is sword swung equal to true? And if it is, do something. So the word I used there that was most important was equals. And for equals, I need to look in the logic section. In the logic panel, scrolling down, we can find the comparison part. And the comparison section contains all comparisons of one thing and another. So we need to compare sword swung with true. So here it's comparing 0 with 0. Is 0 equal to 0? We're going to take that and edit a little bit. So I'm going to take this first diamond, the 0 equals 0 diamond. I'm going to pick that up and I'm going to put it in the diamond slot of the if statement. At the moment it is saying if 0 equals 0, which is kind of useless to us. I need to update this, so instead it's saying if sword swung equals true. So to do that, I need the sword swung variable. To find it, we can go to the variables panel, and in the variables panel, down here we've got sword swung, and it's in the oval shaped bracket. So I'm going to bring out the sword swung, and I'm going to put it in the left hand side of the equals. So I'm going to replace the first 0. If sword swung equals, and as we can see, it's complaining. Let's see what it's complaining about, what the error is. The operator equals cannot be applied to types Boolean and 0. So again, this is the same problem as we had earlier. Sword swung only deals with two values, true or false. It can't do numbers, it can't do text, it can't do names, it can only do true or false. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to compare that with 0, which doesn't work. We need to compare it with true. So again, go to the logic panel, and we can pick up true from the bottom of the logic panel, where we've got the true block down here, the diamond shaped true. I'm going to put that in the equals to replace the right hand 0. If sword swung equals true. So what this is asking is, if the sword is being swung, what should I do? Well, we should probably damage or hurt or kill the enemy. So let's go ahead and do that. There's a lovely little piece of code in the sprites panel called destroy. The destroy block will destroy any sprite you tell it to. So I'm going to pick up the destroy block, which is in effects, and I'm going to put it in the first C shape of the if, the first hole there. So I'm going to say if sword swung equals true, destroy something. At the moment, this block of code is trying to destroy my sprite, which, as we said, doesn't exist. So let's go ahead and update that with something that does exist. Now, I can't do my usual trick of using the drop down arrow and changing it to what I want to get rid of, what I want to delete. And the reason why is if I were to change it to be the enemy, When I say destroy my sprite, it won't destroy the right one. Because we've got the just repeat 4 times and we're setting the enemy variable to be the enemy sprite, it will destroy whichever one was last to be created, which won't work. We need to actually destroy the exact one that our player is overlapping with. So on sprite of kind player overlaps other sprite of kind enemy. We need this other sprite, the one we're currently hitting. So, how do I get that other sprite? Well, this is where MakeCode Arcade gets a little bit confusing, because the other sprite we need is actually kept inside this event. This event says on sprite of kind player overlaps other sprite of kind enemy. Well, the other sprite is here. And if I pick this up, if I click and drag, I can take that other sprite and do something with it. And if I pop it in the destroy, well, first things first, it replaces my sprite, which is decided to leave the destroy and hide awkwardly underneath that. I'm just going to go ahead and delete that. But it's going to destroy the exact sprite that is overlapping the player. So just to recap, I grabbed other sprite by picking up from the top of the event, the overlap event. And that is how we destroy the right enemy. Now we can add a little bit of flair to that. If we click the plus on destroy, it gives us more options, and in this case it gives us options for effects. That is how it looks when we do the attack. So if I use the drop down arrow, I've got a complete set of effects I could use, and you can decide which one works best. I find fire is a very nice looking effect. It's good for destroying an enemy. We're going to destroy the other sprite with the fire effect. Okay. Before we move on to the next bit, I'm just going to update a little. Just going to take a look at the simulator just to see what our code does so far. So let's go back into the simulator. Okay, I can still walk around. The lions aren't hurting me yet. We haven't programmed that. If I press A whilst next to one of them, they get destroyed, so I am hurting them. And I got those two as well. So yeah, we've actually managed to destroy the lions, which works out quite well. Okay. So how do we deal with when we don't attack? When either we don't have time to attack, or maybe we're not quick enough, or maybe we're not paying attention. We want the lions to actually attack us a little bit. We want to be attacked by the enemy. That makes the game fun. It gives us something to do. What we can do is available over in the info panel. In the info panel, we've got things like life, score, countdown, multiplayer and all that. So we could maybe reduce our score a little bit, or we could maybe lose a life. That might be a good shout actually. If we get hit by a lion, we could lose a life. So in the info panel, I'm going to pick up the change life by -1. And I'm going to put that down here in the else part of the if. So what this does now is if we've got our sword out, we destroy the enemy that we're overlapping. Otherwise, we lose a life. Now, this will cause a couple of complications, but we will look at that at another time. Before we can fix things though, there's a little problem in that how can we change a life by -1 if we haven't told the game what number of lives we start with? So if the game doesn't know how many lives we have to start with, how can it -1 from them? It might start you with 0 lives and then you end up with -1 lives. How does that work? So what we need to do is we need to go back to our old friend, the onStart event. Because what we want to do is we want to add a block so that on starting the game we set the number of lives. So I'm going to go back to the info panel, and in the info panel I can find the set life to 3. So I'm going to pick that one up and I'm going to put it at the top of onStart. So I start the game and I immediately set the life to 3 lives. So now when I look down at the bottom with the overlapping code, when I remove a life, then that will have an effect. Let's have a look and see what happens. Let's click play. Okay, so the lions are coming towards me. If I attack one of them, let's go for this one, it damages them. But if I let them come straight towards me, let's see what happens if I don't attack. Oh dear, I lost. But a little problem there. You notice that I lost all of my lives in one go. Surely I should only be losing 1 life. Let's try again. Let's get one lion to attack me. No, I lost all my lives again. Why was that? Well, the reason for that is when I -1 life, I remove 1 life from the player, but the player is still overlapping the enemy. So this event is still triggering again. So even though I've lost a life, I'm still touching the enemy, which means I'm going to lose another life. But I'm still touching the enemy, which means I'm going to lose another life. But I'm still touching the enemy, so it means I'm going to lose another life until I end up with 0 lives and the game ends. We're going to fix this, but I'm going to save that to the next video. So in the meantime, thank you very much for watching. Remember to save your game. Remember that MakeCode Arcade is a little bit buggy when it comes to saving your code. So every time you have made a significant change in your game, click the big green save button at the bottom. In any case, I hope you've enjoyed, and I will see you in the next video.